Good morning, everyone, and welcome to you, Chief Constable, and your team to this November meeting in public. Welcome also to anyone joining us online, and thank you for your interest in the Policing Board and indeed policing. Chief Constable, thank you for your report. Today, of course, marks 1 year since your formal appointment to the office, so your reflections around this are very welcome. This week also marked 23 years since the establishment of the Police Service of Northern Ireland and the Policing Board, so happy birthday to all those here. The importance of the service, of democratic oversight and the principles on which our policing arrangements are founded remain absolutely fundamental to the future safety and security of our community. These are points that we as a board have made in our response to the draft programme for government, which I'm sure many other people have made as well. Policing has been a mainstay of our peace process. Whilst much progress has been made, we know that people's experiences of the benefits of peace are not the same across our society. Proper investment in resourcing for policing and as well as the Northern Ireland Executive support for the service is essential if we are to achieve the safe society we collectively desire and the ambitions of the programme for government. I want to start, as is becoming a recurrent theme, on resourcing. So we welcome that in the first UK budget, 45.8 million additional monies were given to the Executive for the PSNI's Additional Security Fund and the Executive Programme on Paramilitarism and Organised Crime. We are, of course, waiting on the work through of the other monies that have been announced and what will be coming to justice and indeed to policing. The board supports the PSNI in its current recovery plan to increase officer numbers to 7,000 and staff numbers to 2,572, which is a very precise number. Over the course of the next 3 years, that will take place, which will mean a total additional funding requirement of 201 million over a 5-year period. In our programme for government response, we have articulated the risks and also the opportunities going forward in terms of improving collaborative working on community safety issues across departments, as well as organisational effectiveness within the Police Service of Northern Ireland. My personal experience, just to share that with you in recent weeks while attending various meetings and events across the country, has shown a genuine desire and appreciation of collaborative working and cross-departmental collaboration, and that I find is very encouraging. Moving to the topic of safer society, on Tuesday evening I attended an excellent engagement event led by ACC Singleton, where we heard firsthand of the continuing impact of the summer events on our diverse communities in Northern Ireland. And in the last few weeks we have seen the devastating impact of the catfishing case and the harm caused, not to mention the now alarming numbers of femicides in Northern Ireland following the recent murders of Mary Ward, Mandy McGill and toddler Tavia da Costa. We have, as you know, been consulting on our 5-year plan and people wanting visible policing. They want the police to be engaged in communities and they want issues that affect that sense of safety in the community to be addressed, and I'm sure you will have further comments on that, Chief Constable. I want to move on to officer support. To the officers and staff who have been engaged in progressing some very distressing cases, we want to acknowledge that work and also seek assurance that they too are getting support from the PSNI. It is clear from your report that there has been a lot of very positive policing work and very successful operations. Although I always end on a high, Chief Constable, this month I need to mention something that's not so good, and I'm sure and I hope that you will address this in your notes or later on in questioning. I hope the Police Ombudsman report on the 74 officers inappropriately accessing and sharing data serves as a reminder to all PSNI officers and staff of their responsibilities around privacy and data protection issues in their work and the consequences of inappropriately accessing and sharing information without legitimate authority to do so. So that concludes my opening remarks, Chief Constable. If we could take your opening comments, and then before we move to questions from members of the board, we're going to ask Acting Deputy Chief Constable Chris Todd to give us an update on the work to date on the data breach.
Thank you, Chair. And certainly with regards to your opening remarks, I'd be keen to assist you with some of the issues that you've raised. I'd like to do this introductory session just in two parts, if I may. Firstly, and very, very briefly, due to the proposed agenda, which I welcome, of examining the outworkings and response of the PSNI to the data breach, I'm going to be quite brief now. With regards to the operational response to the data breach, known as Operation Sanukai within the organisation, I do want to personally thank every member of the organisation for how they responded to the events of the 8th of August last year. Chris Todd, as you've referenced, Chair, who did an excellent job in leading the response, will address you shortly on the detail. But before doing so, I'd offer that very few organisations either could or would have responded with the swift and robust measures that were put in place to both devalue and recover the information placed in the public domain. I've spoken very openly, both at the time in this room of the independent review team report being released in December last year, and upon the release of the Information Commissioner's Office's findings in May this year, and indeed only last month at the board meeting, sitting alongside the Information Commissioner during his appearance before the board, about the impact this incident had on our officers and staff. I pay particular tribute to them, but especially to their families, for the way they've all responded to this event and the distress it will have caused because of the complex past of Northern Ireland and the enduring threat to our workforce. When the Information Commissioner, John Edwards, set out his rationale for the removal of the enforcement notice last month, he cited the immense work that's been done to address the issue at hand and described the confidence that the PSNI workforce can now have regarding our information management. That accolade has been hard earned, and I pay tribute to every person who secured it. And that endorsement meant the removal of any enforcement notice against the organisation. I will also say, before asking Chris to make further comments, that I did invite Peter O'Doherty, the then Assistant Commissioner, now Temporary Commissioner of the City of London Police, who led the independent review team, and I remind the board to come back and revisit how we've responded to his recommendations. And it's my intention to conduct that process in the early part of next year, just for further reassurance. But with that, if I may, I'll hand over to Chris.
Thank you. And just you mentioned Peter Doherty, we had several engagements with Pete, and we would welcome that initiative as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chief. First of all, as the Chief has just mentioned there, I think it's right that I acknowledge, first of all, the impact that this had on all of our people, significant impact in many cases, and continues to have impact on some of our people. So I'm very conscious that when I talk about this, it will be difficult for some of our people who may be listening, and I recognise that. But to return to the circumstances, first of all, just as a reminder, it was just over a year ago. So the breach occurred on the 8th of August 2023, 14:31, 2:30 in the afternoon to be precise. And the circumstances were that in response to a Freedom of Information request, a record from our SAP system, as it's called, but basically a record of the personnel details of all of our people was posted inadvertently to the response to that Freedom of Information request on the What Do They Know website. So that was 9,500 of our colleagues who were directly impacted. Their details were posted. I was then informed of the breach at 16:10 that day. My first response was the damage is obviously with that material being on the site, so the first thing we need to do is get that taken down. We managed to achieve that by 16:51, so about 40 minutes later. The ICO were informed at 17:10, and by 6 o'clock I was sitting down holding a gold group to start working through our immediate response to this. I think it's important to note that at that time there was no playbook for this, so there was you know, around this table here you see a lot of experienced commanders in things such as Strategic Firearms Command, Public Order and Events, CBRN. We are used to turning to experience, training, plans, structures, and if necessary, peers who've dealt with similar things before. There was none of that available to us at that time. We were kind of on our own in how we approached this. But that gold group that sat down at 6 o'clock that afternoon was the start of that, because quite frankly, I was fortunate to be surrounded by some brilliant people who are adept at operating in a crisis. The immediate actions then that we brought together, first of all, was the communications to all of our people. And then, of course, this was in the public domain pretty quickly, as you can imagine. So we called together a media event, and there was international media representation as a result of that. We established an emergency management threat group straight away, and people worked very late that evening, including people at the table today, through the night to offer welfare and support and security where necessary for all of our colleagues. Over the course of what turned out to be weeks and months, 4,000 of our colleagues across the service asked for support in response to that. But as I say, the impact on our people shouldn't be underestimated. We do know, as a result of interviews on exit, that there are 8 people at least in the organisation who referenced the impact of the data breach at the point that they decided they would leave the organisation. We immediately put in place measures to shut down sharing arrangements and to mitigate any issues around that, and also to mitigate the absence of data sharing where necessary. So clearly business had to carry on, and the sharing of information with partners is crucial to that. So where we weren't immediately able to share in the way that we've been accustomed to, we would put measures in place to accommodate business as usual. We gave back to every member of staff the line of data which affected them individually, so they could see precisely what information had been breached in their own individual circumstances, so that they could then make a proper assessment. And I think this was really important, that we were transparent with our people from the outset. We established on our internet site some pages. So the operational name for the response to the data breach was Operation Sanukite. We set up some pages with frequently asked questions, because we were getting lots of queries through the EMTG in particular, which we could, rather than repeatedly answer, we could put out there so that people could bring that information up where required, and then focus the efforts through the EMTG in a more personalised way. And we gave personal updates throughout this. The communication was absolutely key to the way in which we responded to this. So at every significant milestone, I wrote out personal messages explaining where we were, what was happening and why. And as a matter of course, every Sunday evening I gave an update to all of our people so that they could be advised throughout. There was no surprises from the moment that this happened until now, indeed. Security enhancements were provided for those that needed them. There were 75 colleagues that we had to make special arrangements for. That was largely as a result of one of the individuals who was subsequently arrested in possession of the data set, which I'll come to. And subsequently, we provided what we called the universal offer to every member of the workforce. That took some negotiation. I'm really grateful to everybody's support, including the boards, in pushing forward with that and securing the money to support that in the relatively short term. 90% of the workforce took up that offer of up to £500 to provide whatever measures were required to enhance their security or secure their sense of safety, and it was different for everybody. So 7.8 thousand colleagues, 7,800 colleagues took up that offer. 90% of the workforce, £3.4 million was made available to support that. The litigation, no doubt, will be something that people are interested in. Colleagues with me today will be able to explain more around the detail on that, but suffice to say it is ongoing, but it's on the public record that we have accepted liability for that. It's for the courts to determine the detail now. The incident itself obviously had to be investigated in two ways. One was what happened and why, and how can we stop it happening again, and also was anybody accountable and should be held to account, myself included in that. So we brought in, with the board's support, the independent review team, as the Chief mentioned, and they set about doing just that. In the meantime, one of the key elements of this strategy was, once the information goes out on the internet, no matter that we took it down as quickly as we possibly could, and it was only out there for 2 and a bit hours, it's out there. And once it's out there, you can't retrieve it. You can make every effort to get as many copies back as you can, but you can never be assured that once it's on the internet that it hasn't been copied and held somewhere else. So we have to have a reasonable working assumption that it would be in the hands of those that might use it to cause us harm. So, accepting that we'll never be guaranteed that we've got every copy back, we set about trying to devalue the data set to make it as near as possible useless to those that would seek to cause us harm. So that included measures such as changing the service numbers of everybody in the organisation, which was no mean feat, but it was achieved, and everybody now has an individual personal identification number, which is different. So the numbers that are on that data set are not the numbers that we now use in our day-to-day business. We did our own investigation, initiated that to look at where this data had gone and how it was being used to keep our people safe and the public safe. We used our crime ops department, obviously, our cybercrime teams, and where necessary, our terrorist investigation units, and we sought help from national partners, including the NCA and GCHQ. We even went, when we got to a point, and I should say that there were 967 attempts to access the data while it was up. We resolved that to 221 IP addresses, and we identified 105 of those IP addresses, and we progressed each of those individuals to see if it was a legitimate use or not, and many of them were. One of them, for example, would have been my own when it was first brought to my attention. Then obviously you need to substantiate that, and you look at the website, that leaves a footprint. So it was understandable that some of those checks would have been completely innocent. We needed to identify which ones weren't. But we could only resolve 105 of those IP addresses because some of them would have been obfuscated using VPNs, etc. Some of them would have been in jurisdictions overseas that we couldn't access. But to satisfy ourselves that we hadn't missed anything, and bearing in mind we'd used what we thought were the top people in the UK from all of those agencies I described, we went outside of the UK and we went to the FBI for peer review to make sure that we hadn't missed anything, that there was nothing more that could be done to resolve those addresses, and we got that satisfaction from our partners there as well. Scrutiny has been evident throughout. Yourselves, obviously, as a board, the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee, there's been 2 specific appearances in relation to this breach, and our own Audit Risk and Assurance Committee will be regularly inspecting in this regard as well. In fact, I was before the committee just 2 weeks ago, I think it was, to go through each of the recommendations and progress against each of those. And of course, as I say, the independent review team and the ICO, who are our regulators, and were informed within an hour of it being brought to my notice so that they could initiate their investigation. So the IRT report first, they came back on the 11th of December 2023. It was really important that the board supported the appointment of the independent review team because we knew that the ICO would take some time to come back with their findings, and we needed to get to the learning as quickly as we possibly could, and we couldn't mark our own homework. We needed somebody to have fresh, objective eyes across this. In their report, and I'll quote from that just to highlight the significance as they identified it. So they said that this was the most significant data breach that has ever occurred in the history of UK policing, not only because of the nature and volume of compromised data, but because of the political history and context that sets the backdrop of contemporary policing in Northern Ireland, and therefore the actual or perceived threat towards officers, staff and communities. They went on to identify 37 recommendations. That included the one of the recommendations that we should progress all of the existing ICO recommendations from a prior inspection, not in relation to this, but in relation to subjects such as data sharing more generally. And we had some BAU, business as usual, recommendations sitting there as well. So there's 110 in total that we've had to work through. But focusing specifically on the 37 recommendations from the independent review team, 18 of those are now closed, have been completed. 8 of them sit at green, so good progress is being made, but there's some residual matters that we need to just complete in order to close those. 10 of them sit at amber, so progress is being made, but we need some support around aspects of that. And 1 sits at red, which means that we haven't progressed it. That is the replacement of the SAP system, which was a system that was breached. And that is down to financial constraints at the moment and securing the right system to replace that and the finances to support that. So that hasn't been ignored. That is being worked on, so to speak, but we haven't been able to make the progress, so we're holding it as red at the moment. One of the key recommendations within that was to elevate the responsibility for the senior information risk owner to the Deputy Chief Constable's office, and that's where it sits now. I think that's really important to note because, and we did have some discussion with the independent review team, whether that should sit with the Deputy or with the Chief Operating Officer. I'm satisfied that it is in the right place for a number of reasons, one of which is that as the Deputy, I also have responsibility as the Senior Responsible Officer for our sensitive equities, so those aspects of data and information that relate to covert policing, etc. So now I have sight across all aspects of data and information, and it is only the Deputy and the Chief that have access alongside the ACC crime to some of those assets. So it all sits in one place. And also it was important that it was elevated from one of the ACCs because none of the ACCs have sight across the whole of the organisation. So at the time of the breach, the ACC operational support, who was the CSIRO, the breach itself involved staff within that department, but also within HR department, also within comms, etc. So it's important that it does sit at that level, so there's oversight across the whole of the service. And through the elevation of that to the Deputy's post, was the establishment of the Service Data Board as well now, which oversees all of this work, and the Data Delivery Group has been established to do the doing, so to speak, and to report into the Service Data Board, and all of those recommendations are being progressed through those structures now. A key one of those recommendations also was to support the resourcing within our Corporate Information branch and to support the Data Protection Officer, who had very limited staffing around them prior to this. So that is all much more robust now, and that is enabling us to make great progress against those recommendations. The ICO investigation came back with their preliminary report on the 20th of May this year. They highlighted 3 areas which they had some residual concerns about and required more information. That was in relation to policies, training, and our ability to identify hidden data, which was the issue around this breach, that hidden spreadsheet that was attached to the response to the Freedom of Information request. They also gave an indication of the fine that they were considering and asked for our comments in respect of that. We fed back where we were against each of those 3 areas, and we also fed back where we were financially, to emphasise the point that any fine was going to have an impact on this police service because, well, we've discussed the financial situation of the police service, and it was not affordable regardless. But we understand the reason why that fine was being suggested. And having reported back to the ICO, they came back again on the 26th of September. And they did confirm that there would be a £750,000 fine, reduced from 5.6 million, using the public sector approach. I was satisfied that they'd listened to what we'd said, but I understood that they'd applied that public sector approach appropriately, and they felt that it was important that it was illustrated to ourselves and everyone else the importance of this and the need for there to be a fine to reflect that, as was described by John Edwards when he was here previously. So we haven't appealed that fine. But it's really important to note that no enforcement notice arose. and everything that was asked of us was achieved in the eyes of the ICO, and they were very clear about that, and they were very complimentary about the cooperation they got from all of our people that they engaged with throughout this investigation. To paraphrase what John Edwards said to us, he said that he deals with lots of these situations, and very often chief executives and top teams will make promises to resolve issues, and very often that doesn't materialise, but the PSNI delivered, and he was grateful for that. I'll also say that in parallel to this, there was another ongoing issue with the ICO, which was around our freedom of information requests and our subject access requests and our compliance with meeting those within statutory timelines. That had previously been subject to a potential enforcement notice, and we'd resolved that, but when we had this data breach, it effectively, the performance there fell off a cliff again, for reasons you can imagine. So we had to resolve that in parallel to this work, and when the ICO came back, they made comment that they were impressed with the work that had been done by everybody in those teams to bring that level of performance back up to a position which was acceptable again and is being sustained. And again, to quote John, and I know he won't mind me stealing this quote from him, but he said, effectively, we'd managed to rub our tummy and pat our head dealing with two very difficult issues at the same time. There's been UK and global impact from this. It's not just an issue for PSNI. There were a number of police services, for example, who had suffered similar breaches around the same time, but the impact is unique here, of course, and that's why it's so important. But it is something that is being looked at internationally, and people are looking to learn lessons from our experience. I sit now as the co-chair of the National Data and Analytics Board, which gives me access to all the national assets and best practice. And through that, we've established a Centre for Data and Analytics in Policing, which PSNI now has a key stakeholder in, and we will ruthlessly exploit any opportunity to learn from the work that's going on nationally as a result of that. And we report directly into the Digital Data and Technology Coordination Committee for National Policing. And we've been asked to engage in national and international events to share our learning and help others to understand and deliver some CPD training in some certain places as well. Because as I said earlier, when we picked this up, there was no playbook. But now there is someone for people to turn to, and that's our colleagues in PSNI for their experience and their insight. And I'm grateful to the brilliant colleagues that I've had the honour of working with alongside this, who have helped to develop that now for the benefit of everybody across policing in the future. I will, of course, take questions, Chair, from the board, but I think the Chief has his closing comments to conclude first.
Thank you. Thank you for that oversight. That was very useful.
Would you like to do questions on that?
Yeah,
first,
let's do the data breach. There are a couple of questions. Gerry, first of all.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Chris, for that, I think, very comprehensive rundown on it. Maybe a question you've already answered, or a difficult question to put, but in terms of the 18 recommendations that have been closed, and we've got the rest in terms of green, amber, and the one that's red. Could you give us just a wee bit more detail if you were trying to say this, I suppose, publicly, or to colleagues, prison officers, or sorry, police officers, and the staff, who is your first port of call. Could you point out one or two which had the most impact, in other words, which would give them the most relief as to where it has gone, and especially substantial impact on data governance and protection. In other words, that improves the organisation's operations. I know it's put me in a bit of a spot, but short, you know.
No, thank you, Gerry. Yes, I would say it's primarily around the processes and the training and the resilience of the teams that were involved. So there were a number of people who sort of touched this data set as it went out of the organisation, and no one of them was individually culpable. It's important to highlight that. But what we had within that chain were people who had been put into positions through our recruitment processes, etc., who hadn't been adequately trained. So there are methodologies that are available to identify hidden data, as the ICO pointed out, and not everybody in that chain have been trained effectively, which was an organisational failing. So the training, the accreditation of everybody who's involved in any element of this now is absolutely crucial. Taking steps out of that chain that are unnecessary so that dedicated professionals are limited to the access and the involvement is a key part of that. But that, of course, required additional resilience in those teams. So the staffing within those teams was important as well. And as you are well aware, that there have been no more people made available to us as an organisation. So we have had to look at the staffing across the organisation and put the resilience into those teams in the corporate information branch to ensure that we're not passing things around unnecessarily outside of that team of dedicated professionals, where people don't have the adequate training, etc.
Thanks for that. I think you mentioned that there was 8 police officers who had decided there was too much and the risk was too much and decided to leave. Is that it, or was there staff as well? In other words, are you happy that we've come to the end of that, that sort of people are now sort of feel secure in where they are? I suppose that's the question. Was it just 8, or was there any others?
There's 8 that have specifically said so. So when anybody retires or resigns, they are invited to have an exit interview. Now, not everybody agrees to that or accepts that or wants that. So there might be some people who have not had exit interviews because they didn't want to have an exit interview, who haven't had the chance to tell us precisely why. So there could be potentially others, but certainly there are 8 people who did have an exit interview who said that part of the reason why I've left is because of the impact of the data breach. We do have some residual issues that some members of the board will be aware of in terms of ill health retirements, etc., where there may be compounding issues there as well, but not uniquely, singularly the data breach, if that makes sense.
Thank you. I have a question from Trevor.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thanks, Chris, for giving us all of the stuff in terms of background. I have to say, actually, I'm not sure I would rub your tummy and pat you in the head, because actually the one thing that's actually outstanding in my mind is probably one of the most serious parts of it, which is the system, because it was a system failure. So we're sitting about a year later and we still get this sitting in red. That actually alarms me. The budgetary position of the police, I think if I read somewhere recently, and I'm sure John probably be aware of this, I don't think there was additional finances to cover this court case. So we already know the financial position the police is in and the pressures they're under. We know that there's no money to pay the compensation if it ever is settled. And one of the most major things in my mind in terms of the system hasn't been fixed. And I find that unacceptable.
So thank you, Trevor. And I appreciate that, and I understand why. And I don't disagree that I would desperately want the system to be replaced as soon as we can. What I should highlight, though, was that it wasn't the system that failed, it was the people that failed. So the system is still secure. The system was not breached. It was people who took information out of the system, put it onto a spreadsheet and attached it to another document. So the system is still secure, and it's really important to note that the data that sits within there remains secure. It was a person that attached it to another document, and that's the bit that we've had to rectify. But improvements in systems help us to distribute information and access information in a way which mitigates more effectively against people doing that in the future. So what we have to do in the absence of a new system is build in additional levels of mitigation and security to make sure that that doesn't happen. But the data is remaining secure and always was secure in that system. It was the human error that was the issue, not the breach of the system.
So, sorry, just to pick up on that, are we saying that it's in red because it needs replaced, but the current system there's been adequate security put around it to make sure that it's secure, and the redness is because it's recommended to be changed and it's a nice to have a better system?
Correct. So the recommendation was to replace the system. There are plans to replace the system. We just haven't started implementing them yet, and maybe colleagues who would want to come in around the procurement process.
Just quickly, basically the system we're referring to is our SAP system.
Okay.
And SAP effectively will require to be changed by 2027. So we are working through, there will be a business case process of procurement to get that, but it is a substantial, significant system for our organisation. And these things have quite a lead-in time, but we absolutely take it seriously and are progressing it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, before we move on to our normal questions, Chief, did you have something else to add to anything before we?
Yeah, if I could, if that's the questions on Chris's input on Sanukite, I just wanted to finish my introductory remarks if I may, Chair. As we all know, the PSNI is attempting to meet the growing needs and expectations of communities whilst wrestling with record low numbers of officers and staff, no uplift in recruitment and unacceptably high levels of sickness and ill health retirements. Despite the almost impossible financial pressures that we faced as an organisation, I took the decision to recommence recruitment, as you all know, and I'm grateful for your support. To do otherwise would have been failing the people of Northern Ireland and all of those within the PSNI. We're now starting to reap the benefits of this decision as the first probationary officers are graduating from the police college. But I do need to be clear because of some misreporting. I'm merely replacing those officers that we're losing. This isn't an increase in numbers, and we're barely actually managing to do that. Our numbers are at a dangerously low level and cannot be allowed to go any further. I will not allow that to happen. I was delighted to see this week at Westminster Hall a debate on the funding for policing in Northern Ireland and welcome the contributions from all the different members of Parliament across different parties. The recent budget announcement that you referenced, Chair, of an extra £7 million for additional security funding covers only the existing costs that we have, the growth that we've had to pay for. I welcome the PCTF funding of £8 million, of which a majority should be allocated to the PSNI to allow us, at least in part, to continue the vital work in dealing with paramilitaries. There remains, however, an in-year gap for the PSNI of £37 million. This gap has to be addressed, and through the ongoing budget monitoring process, I would hope this occurs and we get agreement to pay the 4.75% pay rise that has been agreed for police officers. This again, in my view, is non-negotiable. I remain extremely grateful for the support of the Board and the Department of Justice in the REA uplift for our police staff, and will continue to press for the parity of pay uplift for our police officers compared with those colleagues in England and Wales. I'm determined to continue to highlight the deficiency in funding for this organisation and will do so. I will continue to do so until we receive the financial support that's required to keep communities safe in Northern Ireland. The budget announcement of an extra 1.5 billion, taking the total grant now for Northern Ireland to 18.2 billion, is incredibly welcome. It is imperative that the budget of the PSNI finally achieves the support of other public services, such as health and education, that they've received in recent years. Our headcount is dangerously low. I know you understand that, but it's important that everybody understands that. Dangerous both to the health of the workforce, but importantly for the safety of society in Northern Ireland. Despite the Northern Ireland block grant growing by almost 50% since 2010-2011, the PSNI budget has fallen back from 903 million to 896 million. With staff costs, contract costs, inflation, we all know, we don't need to be accountants, what that means has happened to this organisation. From this additional money released through the budget, the recovery plan for the PSNI has to be supported. As a minimum headcount, we need the 7,000 police officers and 2,572 police staff that you referred to, Chair. In simple terms, this will require, in year one, 8 million extra, in year two, 25 million extra, and in year three, 47 million extra. In a previous budgeting exercise, we projected pressures on our planning baseline budget to give you a sense of the challenge, of 166 million in 25-26, 235 million in 26-27, and 307 million in 27-28. Picking up on the comments actually of Trevor, those figures do not include the cost of the data breach, the holiday pay, and there's also going to be some costs around legacy civil cases. These pressures require funding, and the PSNI must receive the fiscal support previously afforded to others. The organisational response and safety of communities can no longer be taken for granted. In my time as Chief Constable, a number of independent reports have highlighted the unacceptable funding position of the organisation. These reports have come from the HMIC FRS, the IRC Independent Reporting Commission, the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee, and the Criminal Justice Inspectorate of Northern Ireland. As your Chief Constable, I expect predictions of insufficient resources negatively impacting on performance to become a reality, and this is going to put lives at risk. This can still be arrested, but only if proper funding is provided, but it needs to be provided now. I look forward to submitting a very comprehensive business case for the recovery of the PSNI to the Department of Justice that I'm aware the board have assisted us with, and we've already had a shared endeavour with the department with regards to completion of that business case. One aspect where our low numbers will have a collateral and negative impact on tackling issues, and is extremely relevant to a number of us in this room, is our determination to tackle violence against women and girls. The murder of 4 women over a 6-week period, recently reported, is shocking and sobering, coinciding as it did with the Stormont executive announcement of its Ending Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, and indeed the relaunch of our own Violence Against Women and Girls action plan after its first 2 years. Tackling violence against women and girls is an absolute priority for this organisation. There is no doubt that we've made significant progress in our efforts pursuing and prosecuting perpetrators, building relationships with key partners and bolstering training and challenging our own thoughts and behaviours. Unfortunately, too often, by the time the police become involved, it is too late. This is a societal issue where we all need to play our part, and in that, respect each other and continue to make it a hostile environment for perpetrators. In all female murders in the last 5 years, someone has been charged or reported for the offence of murder, except in those cases where people committed suicide who are involved. Currently, you're also in discussions with partners in health and social care to pilot a daily joint risk management meeting with social services for those domestic abuse cases that have occurred in the preceding 24 hours. I'm obviously acutely aware of the recent frightening attacks on females in Derry, Londonderry, and the impact this is having on women in the area. It's important to highlight that incidents of violence against women and girls have actually reduced in Derry City and Strabane in the last 12 months. And what we're seeing is not actually an increase in offences, but a very welcome and a very overdue focus on the reality of violence against women and girls in everyday life. These latest 2 reports are incredibly concerning because they are so unusual. I provide an absolute commitment to prioritise resources to ensure people are kept safe in that local community. But the focus is on making sure perpetrators do not feel safe to go about their vile business, that people report predatory and suspicious behaviours. I'm incredibly encouraged by speaking to officers dealing with those cases, and have personally engaged with Chief Superintendents Gillian Kearney and Lindsay Fisher, who are determined to see those investigations to a successful conclusion. On the 21st of October, as the PSNI, we launched an 8-week public consultation on our draft Race and Ethnicity Action Plan for 2025 to 2027, Equality in Action, delivering effective and trusted policing for minority communities, officers and staff. You referred to this in your opening remarks, Chair. I encourage everyone to engage with this consultation and to provide feedback to support our efforts to address and build a more equitable and inclusive police service and improve our response to those from ethnic minority communities, particularly obviously with regards to the awful incidents of hate crime, many of which we saw during the summer. That consultation closes on Monday the 16th of December 2024 and can be accessed on a link through our website. In advance of questions that understandably hold me to account for issues that concern the board and indeed will concern me, I do want to reinforce that each and every day that the PSNI rank and file do a job that most people in society simply could not do. They do it with humility, professionalism and pride. They are the finest examples of public servants. To that end, in October, we hosted the second of our Team PSNI events, where the service executive team, who accompany me here, and I have the opportunity to engage with over 600 officers and staff from across the organisation to acknowledge the work they do each and every day, as well as providing an update on future planning for the service and listening to the thoughts and views of those who attended. Our reconvened long service award ceremonies have now resulted in 9 events this year, with over 1,000 officers and staff, family and friends celebrating and acknowledging their service to the public of Northern Ireland. Frankly, you mentioned a year in role, Chair. This has proven to be a year of organisational survival, in my view. However, collectively, the people accompanying me to this board meeting, and I will say the members of this policing board, have all rallied. We're seeing a greater workforce engagement, cohesion and an upturn in morale. We need to build on this because there is a lot more to do. But I do want to thank the staff associations and the support groups for their roles in re-energising the organisation. Finally, although there's much work to do, I know that you share in my acknowledgement of the fantastic work that I see colleagues undertake every single day, working tirelessly to protect individuals and communities, often running towards danger when others are fleeing it. I'll continue to press for additional resources that I believe are both required and overdue to ensure that the police service is fit for purpose and can deliver for the people of Northern Ireland. And I will make no apology for completely and utterly and regularly repeating this. I want to thank the board for their continued support, particularly during the last 12 months for the organisation and the officers and staff within it. I was going to now open up for questions, Chair, but because you mentioned at the end of your opening remarks the body-worn video media reporting, I just want to mention that if I can, in case questions don't raise the issue. So let me be clear, the actions of those officers was absolutely unacceptable. I'm the first to praise this organisation because of what I see every day, but I'm also the first to accept when we got things wrong. The behaviour of those over 70 officers do not reflect the standards of this organisation. We've seen all too often in recent years police officers using abusive, inappropriate behaviour, behaving in a way that is criminally. The circumstances of this incident, although absolutely abhorrent and unacceptable to me, do not represent those behaviours that we've seen elsewhere. On the 23rd of December 2022, the Ombudsman commenced an investigation in relation to a number of officers having viewed a body-worn video of an incident without a lawful purpose. This was uncovered as part of an unrelated inquiry. The body-worn relates to a stop search of a member of the public for drugs offences. The arresting officer made a mistake in the issuing of the caution. The officer corrects it and issues a second caution. Upon completion of the investigation, it was established that 74 officers could not provide a lawful purpose for having access to the footage. The Ombudsman recommended that all these officers should be dealt with under misconduct regulations by way of a management meeting for breaching Articles 3.1 of the Code of Ethics with regards to privacy and confidentiality. The appropriate authority determined that the officers had misconducted themselves and directed that it was proportionate that they be dealt with by way of management action, which was subsequently issued to all of those officers involved. The member of the public involved was notified but declined to make a complaint. The officer involved was spoken to. He was aware that a large number of colleagues had viewed the footage and understandably felt embarrassed. He was provided with appropriate welfare support. It appears from the investigation that the officer's motivation to view the footage was one of ill-guided stupidity and humour at their colleague's mistake. Whilst wholly inappropriate, it confirms that the member of the public was not the subject of interest. The Ombudsman did not consult the Public Prosecution Service with regard to any necessity for any criminal proceedings. I thought it was important because you'd introduced the issue that I set out some clarifications, Chair. I will look to Chris in his PSD role and colleagues if there's any other comments that people want to make, but obviously questions may still flow from that incident, for which I apologise on behalf of the organisation.
Thank you. Just to add to what the Chief has described there, and by way of assurance to prevent this happening again, measures have been put in place since then for exactly that purpose. So we interestingly, the incident itself, it's important to note that that took place in December 2019, albeit the Ombudsman identified it in December 2022. Before it was brought to our attention by the Ombudsman, we had already put in place some measures to protect against this. So that includes some automated processes that we have to identify when body-worn video is being accessed now, which then flags up that the officer must put in a reason for access. And we have means of identifying when there is multiple viewing and multiple sharing now. There's more we could do in terms of automation, and we're looking into that as well in the future as well, but we have processes which catch this already. We also have the assurance and scrutiny regime in place now, which we didn't have then. So you'll be aware that we established a service accountability panel for a number of reasons to look across particular our use of intrusive powers, and the use of body-worn video is an important scrutiny tool in that. So we conversely, additionally, we look at our use of body-worn video through that panel as well. That was established in November 22, and the policy was updated in relation to the use of body-worn video in February 23, in no small part by the influence of the Service Accountability Panel to scrutinise further to make sure that everything was being put in place to prevent incidences such as this reoccurring. So I hope, Chair, that will give some assurance to the board.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for responding and giving us that reassurance. And Chief Constable, could I also welcome the steps that the PSNI are taking and the initiatives in relation to the horrible area of violence against women and girls. That's very welcome as well. Now I'm going to move to members for questions. Could I remind members, as I always do, to be aware and the need of care around questions in order that they don't breach any sensitivity or ongoing proceedings. So with that in mind, could I open with our Vice Chair, Brendan, who's got a question on budget impact and funding on data breach?
Thanks, Chair. Thank you, Chief Constable, for your report to the board. If I may, what I'd like to do is perhaps tease out some further clarity around the funding challenges faced by the service. To kick off, you've mentioned that the budget forecast for the end of the year now is a deficit of 37 million, and I think as a board we would want to emphasise just how vital it is that that is now met through the October monitoring round. But from my own personal perspective, I think it's also important to highlight, in case people feel that policing is a bottomless pit, because there was reporting in the media that there was additional funding of 45 million from the Treasury through the Northern Ireland office for additional security funding, which is not the case. There's always been 38 million in the budget, and the additional funding was only 7 million. I think it's important to clarify that. But in your report, you go on to mention that in looking ahead, next year, the deficit is going to be in excess of 100 million, and then looking ahead to 27-28, that's going to be moving up to in excess of 200 million. And again, I think just to reassure the public and the board that resources are being well managed and that they're not running out of control, it would be useful just to give some clarity as to how those figures have come about. Because are you saying that based on this year's funding, if this deficit is met, you're going to spend another 100 million next year, or are these forecasts actually based on some totally irrelevant historic figure, if that makes sense? And if your budget, if your funding this year requirements are met, what in fact is the uplift in terms of the pressures next year? That's my first point. And then my second point is around these exceptional items, holiday pay, data breach, and legacy, which it would be normal practice to be met from other sources through the Treasury. But we had the Minister of Finance announcing that the Treasury has informed them that there is no additional money coming through, or at least that's their position at this stage. So have you any sense of the quantum regarding holiday pay, data breach and legacy, which would then need to be met out of the Northern Ireland budget if Treasury isn't going to step in?
So there's quite a lot in there, Brendan, and I think the sharing of the business case, when we formally submit it, will answer a considerable number of these questions. But let me just be clear with regards to figures I gave you around what's happened since 2010 to this organisation. And it's unfair in a way to compare us with health and education. Speaking in the interests of health and education, not the PSNI, we're very different public services. We have different challenges. I would say we are the public service that is called upon when all the other public services don't know how to deal with criticality. We're the indemnity, we're the insurance policy. But in effect, our budget has gone from 903 million in 2010, 2011 to 896. That's why our headcount has gone down. That's why a lot of our fleet needs replacing. That's why we've got a training school that was a recommendation in the Patent Commission. There should be a new one provided, and it's never been done and not been funded. We have got a budget provided for the PSNI that's done in year. That budget is not sufficient to run this organisation. In the early part of this year, you'll recall that we were having discussions at board meetings and off table around the significant deficit gap that we had that was addressed because the executive came back into office and there was money found to address that gap. We start each year with a deficit. Over the years that this organisation has not been funded, they've had to make cuts. Those cuts effectively, and I know there is always more that can be done. You can always re-examine pressures. But there's no big transformation opportunity here. We aren't a black hole for money. The PSNI is not. If you compare us with other organisations, I want to talk about getting police officers into schools. On whatever way you look at a matrix to compare ourselves with policing England, Wales or Scotland, we have less officers because of what's happened over the last 10 years. So the reason I gave you some of the figures today around the deficit because of the monitoring of the budget that we've done. So I gave you the year on year for the next 3 years. That's without taking into account the 3 areas that, well, 2 areas you mentioned, holiday pay and the data breach, but I do have to say I raise considerable concerns about legacy, inquest and the cost of those. Which, for legacy inquest, I'll be quite frank, why am I as the Chief Constable of the PSNI in 2024 trying to find money to address legacy inquest issues that occurred in the 70s, in the 80s? This organisation was formed in 2001. Now I know with the devolution of policing in 2010 certain decisions were made, but I think, and I know you know, there aren't cash cows anywhere. I think there is a legitimate, sensible argument to try to seek some support around at least those costs. We all know the pressures from the data breach, which I've admitted liability because, again, as an inherited issue, for the organisation to move forward, we've got to get past the data breach. Part of that was today and the processes. We've spoken about the data breach repeatedly in this forum about what we're doing to secure people's information, not just officers, by the way. We always concentrate on that. We have such sensitive information of victims. We have to make sure that we're the custodians of that information with real confidence of communities. So there's a lot in that. We need funding. We're setting out what that amount is required next year and over the next 3 years. We need a comprehensive spending review that covers 3 years, not one. This next year is going to be a 1 year settlement, I'm pretty sure, but I'm hearing all sorts of positive comments about them looking for a 3 year settlement. I have a 5-year plan for this organisation to get us back on our feet. And I've been entirely realistic about the officers that I'm asking to recruit and staff. I'm not in any way being disproportionate or fair. 7,000 police officers is not enough to police Northern Ireland. It is not. Be very clear. There is no parity with the Met. There is no parity with West Midlands or Greater Manchester Police. But it's a beginning. The figures of what that costs, we can set out very clearly. I've given some of them to you today. But we've got to, and I welcome the programme for government submission that you did. And I know a lot of different organisations and bodies and groups have also submitted their own views on how the PSNI needs to be supported. I'm hoping the outworkings of that are that not just that violence against women and girls and safer communities are priorities for the programme for government, but the specific recovery of the PSNI is as well. On the specifics of the amounts, I think it's something we probably will write to you about because we could debate them forever and a day, but I will just ask Pamela and Mark if they want to make any comments on those issues. But I'm happy to set it all out in a covering letter, which will effectively give you the summary of the business case of what we need. Pamela?
Yeah, no, and again, Mark can give you the exact details on it, but I think what I heard was giving you assurance around financial control. And I think we have demonstrated that to you, hence your support in recognising that the gap's not achievable. And with reference to the circa 900 million for the past 10 years, in my certainly 3 to 4 years, we've continued to get 60 to 100 million pounds of in-year monitoring each year. So the fact that that has come through also, in my view, confirms that government understand that we need that to also break even. And in the main, it's to cover salary costs. It's really substantially its pay. And John has referred to the pay award even coming up that we're seeking to pay, hopefully before Christmas if we can. So if you just accumulate those year on year on year, if you're not getting them into your budget baseline, they continue to be in your gap as well as this year's and next year's and so forth. And that's effectively how you get to the amount of 100 to 200 million over those years. So if the current status of our requirement was baseline, we wouldn't continue to have that gap, but that has been the position for the past number of years. But I'll just let Mark maybe touch on holiday pay and data breach.
Thank you. Yes, so in terms of that figure of around 100 million next year, it is very much aimed at reflecting the historical deficit, the underfunding that's just structurally within our baseline. So this year alone is set out in our resource plan. Our gap is still 37 million, but that is after taking into account some in-year help. So we got 23 million by way of in-year monitoring. So the actual baseline's already down 60 million this year. And as we move into next year with pay and prices, that adds another 40 million. So it's not the costs are running away, they're very predictable and have been well managed, but that's the measure of the structural historic deficit which is built up. Ongoing discussions really around the cost of holiday pay, data breach and legacy. You know, to quantify them, they're certainly in hundreds of millions. It's well without the scale of what we could absorb, or indeed the Department of Justice. There needs to be some kind of assistance probably at the block level, and even then they're probably looking to the Treasury Reserve. So discussions are ongoing in that respect, but they're certainly of such a size and materiality that, yeah, they're out with our ability to deliver.
Thank you, and I welcome a written response that you was suggested. Thank you for that.
Chair, can I just add one thing? It's an example of the challenges we've got. So our budget isn't enough. So we've always got a gap. We had a 60 million rescue in March of this year for the last financial year. We're obviously looking for October monitoring and January monitoring to help us with our 37 million gap this year. With the 4.75% increase that's been agreed by the PRRB, which is the remuneration board that sets the amount for pay uplift for officers, the Treasury have provided policing in England and Wales with £187 million, £187 million. That doesn't cover the entirety of the costs for policing in England and Wales for the 4.75%, but it's a significant proportion of that. We don't see those sorts of elements of support because of the way the block grant works here and the Barnard consequential, so we don't see that. So we do need to take a new approach to how this organisation is funded, and we are not asking, and this is something I really want to reinforce because I think the Deputy Chair's question is right, and Pamela highlighted the need around financial controls and measures. No one is saying the PSNI is running amok with cash. Everybody knows we're not. Everyone knows we've been incredibly responsible. That's why people have looked to us continually. Is there anything more you can do? There is no more we can do. And people are going to, some of the questions today I think will reflect, people will be put at risk if we do not get this recruitment. That's the hard facts. That's violence against women and girls impacted. That's communities impacted. Particularly the youth, it's impacted. So that's why we're being very clear around this. And it's time that we receive the support of the public services do.
Thank you, and thanks for highlighting that again. I've got a question from Frank, and part of that question is in relation to something you mentioned earlier, Chief Constable, about visiting schools. So, Frank?
Okay, thank you very much. Chief Constable, sorry, I understand that. I think we all agree that the allocation of the budget is wrong. The resources are in free fall. For me personally, I understand that everybody has priorities. For me, one of the priorities is the safeguarding and the education of our children and our young people. And there's some amazing work that's done in the schools, educating the children on the dangers of engaging with elder people. The internet, I know some of my grandchildren were taught about the dangers of the internet, yeah, about road safety and that there. So to cut to the chase, with less resources out there, with less money to get the resources out there, what's going to be the impact on educating the young people and the children in the schools, in the communities, and what dangers are they now going to face that they're not facing?
Well, I'm very, very grateful for this question, Frank. I said some time ago that children might not be 100% of our communities, but they're certainly 100% of our future. The protection of children and young people is paramount. This board and committees have received updates of the work that we've done in schools, but we're not doing enough because we don't have enough. The reduction in police officers, especially those involved in community-orientated roles, has had a significant impact on our ability to engage and safeguard children in schools, communities and homes. In a previous role I had, I focused on pupil referral units, those kids who have all sorts of challenges, chaotic backgrounds, by specifically deploying resources around the prevention element. That's something that we simply can't do. Some of the statistics I think I mentioned before around the number of officers that have been removed from our response to neighbourhood policing is incredibly dramatic. But another statistic, looking at other forces around our most similar force families, the proportion of officers in community-facing roles, so that's engaging with schools and communities, is significantly less when you look across an array of different metrics, whether that's the population in the Northern Ireland compared with other forces, or whether it's the geographical area, or the services that we provide. And the work we've looked at shows that we are 390, almost 400 fewer community officers than we would see in similar force areas to our own. This is just getting ridiculous. 390 officers. That will negatively impact on the future of this society. I've made comments to this group before about the activity of paramilitaries in certain estates. There are structures there for those paramilitaries. If we're not in those estates, seeing these kids, and this is policing that goes unseen, preventative stuff, working with colleagues, other partners, those paramilitaries are there, so they'll interact with these kids. So I cannot explain the seriousness of this, and often it's hard to compare policing with the impact on cancer patients in health. But it's about time we started to get pretty more dramatic and I think forthright around the language that we use. And in my view, fewer officers is leading to increased vulnerability among young people to various forms of crime. And I could not be more concerned about it, quite frankly. What I will do, I'm going to ask Bobby to speak to this because Bobby's done some brilliant work, and the team, what they managed to do with what they've got is extraordinary. But Bobby can talk to some of the packages that we are trying to deliver, but if we haven't got the officers to deliver them, they're not being delivered. Teachers are there to teach. Some of the stuff you just described your grandchildren getting. Why are our kids not allowed to get this from their police officers when other police forces can deliver it to their schools? Why is that? It's because we've not been properly funded. So let's get funded. Bobby, can I bring you in on that one, please?
Yeah, thanks, Chief. Just building on what you've said, and frankly, I mean, this will be stark, but even just in the last 2 years, there's half the number of neighbourhood policing teams in Northern Ireland that we used to have. Probably lost about a third of the neighbourhood officers, and the Chief's already talked in terms of that benchmark and showing that we're well under what others would have. We also 2 years ago had neighbourhood coverage 7 days a week, 16 hours a day at school, and being able to sustain that because of the numbers. The officers themselves and we as a team were just massively frustrated about this because we know there's so much more that we could be doing in this space, and even with what we've got left, the impact again of the budget and the resources means that there are massive abstractions on the time of neighbourhood officers, and we've talked about that quite a lot at the board. But look, in spite of that, maybe if I just focus on some of the positives that, I mean, remarkably, the officers in the central teams are still achieving. So you talked about schools, and in particular the schools input, and we have invested significantly in terms of refreshing that entire programme, and that was done in conjunction with both primary and post-primary schools. So we went to them and we asked them, what are the issues that you're identifying through the students that you need quality inputs from the police service on? And again, we're fortunate to have some very skilled people working for us in the police service that developed a full range of new products that can be rolled out to those schools and have been. And the topics that have come up for particular focus are around online safety, something I know you're very focused on, antisocial behaviour, drugs, substance misuse and sextortion, again very relevant when we consider in particular the McCartney case, which we've talked quite a lot about at the board as well. So as well as using those to support our inputs in schools, we've also provided those to the Northern Ireland Curriculum Council, and they're available for all teachers in Northern Ireland to access and supplement the existing curriculum. And we've also had those translated to make sure that they're accessible to minority communities as well. One of the other things that we have been able to do with the limited funds that we have is to support a version of our real events in every single district. Every district's been given some money to be able to run reference engagement and listening events with young people in particular. And we're conscious that it's not just about their safety, as the Chief said in his very first remark. You know, it's right at the forefront of our mind. These are our future police officers and staff, and this opportunity to engage with them through schools and through these real events is critical about, you know, planting the seed with them early about a future and a career in policing. So that's what we're looking to do. I think as well in your question, you'd asked us to try in some way to quantify the impact. I mean, it's exceptionally difficult when we're talking about preventative and engagement work to quantify an impact, but as the Chief has said, and we've said many times at this board before, the bottom line is yes, that less police in the community is going to impact the level of work that PSNI can do, and it will increase the risk to our young people, regrettably.
Thank you. Thank you for those. Are you okay? Thank you. I'm going to ask Cheryl Brownlee to come in at this stage about drugs.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the Chief Constable so far. I just want to touch on a recent BBC documentary called On Drugs, and it focused a lot in the Larne area in my constituency. It was a very raw and very real account of addiction here in Northern Ireland. So in terms of addiction, we know it doesn't just affect the family, the individual. Now it's affecting the whole community in that area. So it's to ask ourselves really what is the PSNI doing to address this? Now I'm very aware that it does not just fall at the door of the PSNI, it is a collaborative issue, but there's a significant concern for me, particularly in terms of young girls and women involved in the cycle of addiction and other potential abuse that they can suffer.
Firstly, I'll definitely speak to you after this meeting around what's going on specifically with the detail that it would probably be wrong to talk about in this public forum. I know that the board's recent surveys just highlighted three principal concerns. One is antisocial behaviour, second is drugs. We'll probably talk about that at a future board meeting. Drugs and managing the issues of drugs in society has been a perennial problem for all of us, going back since I joined policing in the early 1980s. I've spoken though to a number of people, particularly in Belfast City recently, about the almost habitual drug taking and drug use. People going into shops to do deals. We had a question at the last policing board with regards to the use of premises by drug dealers in what people felt was a sort of wanton way of behaviour. We are, as an organisation, statistically, the PSNI, really successful in tackling drugs, seizures of drugs. The numbers are incredibly compelling. Somehow, though, what we're not managing to do is impact on that street activity as much as I want to. Our seizures are higher than they've ever been across all the different drug commodities. But there is more that I know we need to do in a targeted and focused way. What I will say about that again, and this is a drum that I will bang and I will bang and I will bang. Give me the staff to do what I want to do in Northern Ireland, and we will do some incredible proactive work. There is a risk, and I remember seeing Sir George Hamilton speak to this board about what sort of policing does not Northern Ireland want. There is a risk that we'll become entirely reactive. To deal with the sort of problems that you're describing, we need to be proactive. To be proactive, we don't need officers who can't do their community shifts, who no longer cover the period of time that there was a contract almost between ourselves and you as the board when we started the uplifting community policing some years ago, that would provide, because that's gone. So, I mean, obviously I'm going to bring Bobby into this specific one, but I'll visit Larne, I'll speak to the local borough commander, and we'll see what we can do to address the issues that you are highlighting. But a number of this is going to come down to funding and what officers we've got to do what we need to do. A lot of these problems, as you know, are these people in a chaotic life cycle where they will continually and habitually take drugs. That's not something, we can't arrest our way out of that. They'll continue to do that in social behaviour. So that's where other programmes need to come into place. And again, I know there are funding challenges for those programmes. So this needs a whole systems approach. But I'll come and see you, and let me bring Bobby in.
Yeah, I know we've had a brief conversation about this as well. So the Chief's mentioned that even through the board's own community survey, drugs are a priority for communities. It's reflected in the local policing plans and in every single one of our police and community safety partnerships. So that's one of the primary areas, obviously, where we're trying to work collaboratively in order to address this. I think Davey will probably want to say something just about organisationally, the PSNI's collective response, but then also how we tie in with, in particular, Department of Health in order to tackle this. Certainly at a local level, any proactive capacity that we have will be put into that particular area. And that's done by the neighbourhood policing teams, but also our district support teams. And we also work very closely with Davies teams in C1, Organised Crime Branch. And again, our work on that is targeted at street level, but also then looking at a higher level in terms of the groups and the activity that they do in terms of importation and distribution of drugs as well. So I don't know if Davey wants to add anything on that.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. Thanks for the question. And certainly just to provide that reassurance that certainly from crime department, drugs and the problems associated with drugs are a real focus for us. So every day we have officers involved in proactive operations to seek out and bring to justice those that are actively involved in drugs dealing and the harm that creates within our communities. If I can refer you just briefly to page 8 of the Chief's report. Again, there's a snapshot, and it's just a snapshot of some of our activity. Over 7,500 drug seizures over the last year, over 3,000 arrests in terms of drugs. So that activity is ongoing each and every day right across Northern Ireland, but specifically targeted against those organised crime gangs that bring most harm to those communities. And there is a linkage there to paramilitary crime as well, as both the Chief and Bobby have alluded to earlier, and the risks that those groups present in communities right across Northern Ireland. So we're really focused on that, and that's why that additional funding that was also mentioned in terms of the Tackling Paramilitary programme is really critical and essential to continue to drive and suppress the threat that those groups pose to communities. But beyond the proactive element, we also deal with very critically and very carefully all suspected drugs-related deaths to make sure that all lines of inquiry and potential supply routes are considered in respect of those, but also through engagement and education with communities. Frank's question is also relevant in this area with schools, etc. And our capabilities have been reduced over recent years in respect of that, but we're still engaging with communities, we're still talking to communities, we're still listening to communities and reacting in terms of those issues.
Ryan, did you want to come in very briefly on this?
Very briefly, it's just to highlight something which I think is really important, and we are actually having a role in terms of trying to break the addiction cycle and then dealing with the harm that comes from crime. So you'll know within our custody suites we now employ nurses directly, and that has transformed the ability to actually do some work with people who are in our cells and have got addiction issues in terms of screening for Hep B, drug treatment and referrals, and be able to give that response to people when they're with us for that period of time. I feel that's been a really, really helpful step forward for us as well.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a question from Nuala on violence against women and girls.
Thank you, Chair. You mentioned at the start of your briefing around the 4 women who have died within a 6-week period. But since 2020, there have been 24 deaths of women in Northern Ireland, and the majority of them were murdered by men that were known to them and close to them. And we have had instances in the past few years where women have taken their own life, but almost driven to suicide because of domestic abuse by men close to them. So what can you say today to reassure the public regarding the police response for those women and the processes that you have available to you to actually prosecute before it comes to another life lost, and generally to instill confidence with regarding the police response to tackle the issue?
Well, firstly, I think you know, Nuala, my position on this. This is an absolute priority for us. It's a priority for me, and that they're not words; they're absolute commitments to this. I think the numbers are actually slightly higher than you've just quoted since the period of 2020. I think I looked and it was 27 murders. In all of the cases where the offender have not, and I mentioned this in my remarks, the offenders have not either at the time or in the case of a particular tragedy that we've spoken about this board repeatedly, the Katie Simpson case where Cresswell committed suicide during his trial. We prosecuted those responsible. But we all know that's too late. That is too late. We are, through a number of different measures, training, awareness. At the recent Team PSNI events I've highlighted at both events we've had, and there's another one next Tuesday, of the need for our officers and our staff, not just as members of the policing family, but in society, where they see something that causes them concern, to alert us to it with regards to predatory or misogynistic or domestic abuse type behaviours. This is something where I am determined we're going to do our part, but we need help. We need to gain the trust of victims. When they come forward, they'll be treated properly. And I've spoken to Bobby about a case this week. Wherever there are cases that come to our attention, we are ensuring that the investment in the public protection unit, the investment in the best training across the country is here within the PSNI around this issue. In the last 2.5 weeks, I've spoken to the First Minister, the Deputy First Minister, the Justice Minister and the Lady Chief Justice about what more can we do around ending violence against women and girls as a strategic aim. I've had conversations this week with people, experts in England, around what they think they might be able to do, and I'm looking to bring a review of our response in the PSNI in the early part of next year. We're going to do everything we can. A big concern of mine though, Nuala, and I don't want to speak about individual cases, is where, and this is the conversation I had with the organisation, the staff at a Team PSNI event, when the radios go in and they want you to go to another call, if your instinct says I need to stay here because this is the 3rd or 4th time we've been here in the last 2 years, understand the causes, stay there, speak to neighbours, speak to partners, do whatever inquiries you can do to try and understand what's going on. Because sometimes those calls for help are not properly understood. Think of the consequences and the severity of what can happen in these cases. We all know that most murders in this country are domestic homicide murders. The data is very clear. Everybody along this table, I know, because we've spoken about what more can we do as an organisation, is extremely focused on this particular issue at the moment. We've reviewed, as you know, a number of cases where we want to go back and check that we've not missed anything with regards to cases where, sadly, young women have lost their lives. I honestly do believe, and there are certain areas within society in Northern Ireland where I think it's more prevalent, and we need to get the trust of those communities to come and talk to us about what's going on. And those are conversations that we're having off table at the moment, how we reach into those communities to get that alertness and the trust and confidence that they can report to us. So the proof is in the sort of delivery. What I would like to see, I want us to be a victim-focused organisation. That's one of the strategic priorities I think we should have. That's why we joined the organisation. That's why we joined the police, to keep people safe. Is that when victims start saying that they've got more and more confidence, when we see more reports, when we're getting more performance data around prosecutions, that's when I think we can start to understand that we're making progress. So we're open to any suggestions about what more we can do. We're constantly reminding our staff of the need to be vigilant. We're constantly seeking to work more proactively with partners. We're constantly looking to put this on the agenda, and we have what is always a really difficult time coming up with Christmas, a period where there is historically an uplift in domestic related incidents. So to keep women safe, all of the things that we can do, we will do. And if there's anything that you think you can help us with that we're not doing, then please, we're an open book. We're really keen to listen. I will probably just ask Davey. I know he's spoken to this board in great detail about our violence against women and girls strategy, but I do just want to bring Davey in because we're constantly spinning the wheel, so to speak, to make sure we're doing everything we can do with the resources we've got. Davey.
Thanks, Chief, and thanks, Nuala, for the question. And yeah, absolutely shocking, absolutely appalling. When we look most recently at the cases we have had from the 18th of August, we've outside of that, 4 other suspicious deaths that got the full rigour of an appropriate and timely investigation, and 2 other serious assaults not involving women. So in essence, we've had 11 major investigation team investigations from August to now. And I just want to place on record my thanks to those officers who have worked tirelessly to investigate those issues, those incidents, and those terrible incidents, often in really difficult and complex and challenging circumstances. And that's what does drive us forward in terms of our focus, our unrelenting focus on our year 3 of our Violence Against Women and Girls Action Plan. But just to answer specifically some of your questions, because I think it was around some of the offences, and we have made over 1,800 arrests for the new domestic violence offence over the last 2 years. Again, over the last 2 years, we have made over 300 arrests in terms of stalking offences. And from July 2023, when the new offence came into play in terms of non-fatal strangulation, over 1,000 arrests made. So hopefully that sends a really clear message in terms of our relentless pursuit of perpetrators. But to me, that also identifies that there was a gap in terms of legislation, and that gap has been filled. But we will continue to look at areas that we can develop with the Department of Justice in terms of potential offences moving forward. But hopefully that provides a degree of reassurance in terms of our response in respect of those offences. So we are doing things differently. You know, we are focused in terms of the reduction of violence against women and girls, and as the Chief mentioned, we see an overall fall in the numbers, but that does not detract from the seriousness of what we have seen, certainly from August. And our outcome rates are increasing. We are policing our streets differently with a real focus in terms of perpetrator activity and our pursuit of those. We are taking a zero tolerance approach to offenders. We are looking at all opportunities to enhance our officers' understanding of the issues, and over 6,000 officers have received training in respect of coercive control, domestic abuse and new offences, and that will continue. We continue to report to this board, Chair, in respect of our Violence Against Women and Girls Action Plan, and that will continue as we move forward. And we are working with our partners, to name a few, the White Ribbon, Nexus, Women's Aid and others, to ensure that we're both listening to the experience of women, but also trying to address any of those particular concerns. So I think we are working hard. We are working with other partners in terms of the nighttime economy to do everything we can to make Northern Ireland a safer place. But there continue to be concerns, of course, and I would just draw your attention to page 14 of the Chief's report for just this month, that gives a snapshot of some of the cases that have been through the courts in the last month. And if you forgive me, I'll take you through some of those. A man sentenced to 8 years imprisonment, again, for and received sexual offences protection order for 7 years in respect of sexual offences and grooming offences. A man pleaded guilty to over 30 charges, including theft of images, possession of indecent images of children, and inciting the distribution of indecent images and unauthorised access to computer material. A man sentenced to 14 months in prison, suspended for 3 years, and received a sexual offences protection order for 5 years for, again, sexual assault convictions. A man sentenced to 5 years imprisonment and placed on the sex offenders register indefinitely, again in respect of rape and other offences. And a man sentenced to 12 months imprisonment and 12 months unlicensed following a conviction for a number of counts of sexual activity with a child. So hopefully that provides some reassurance that not only are we investigating, charging people, but we're placing them before the courts, and these people are being held to account for that terrible offending. Thank you.
Thank you, that was quite comprehensive, and I think it's important that victims are aware of this too, and working with the nighttime economy coming up to Christmas is one example to let victims know we can help you before it's too late. And you know, if the policing response is wrong just one time, it is enough to kind of break confidence. So it's important to ensure that the victims are aware of ways that they can be helped before they feel it's too late for them. Thank you.
Thank you. That was encouraging. Thank you. I have a supplementary on that from Mark H. Durkan in relation to the recent occurrences.
Thank you, Chair and Chief Constable. You referred to the current situation in Derry in your opening remarks, and I have to say that there certainly appears to have been a robust and proactive police response, particularly to the incidents at the weekend. I was just wondering, could you perhaps elaborate on that in terms of actions taken by the police, additional resources allocated, the sustainability of that, and I suppose any updates or appeals relating to the incidents last weekend in particular?
So I'll be fairly brief on it, Mark, only because the matters are ongoing, but it builds on, as you provide a supplementary question to Nuala's question. In simple terms, we threw the kitchen sink at this and we continue to do so. The period, the latter part of your question, that we can continue to do that is a challenge. These are both extremely unusual and violent attacks. There had actually been 2 unconnected sexual assaults in the same area the previous weekend. In both of those incidents, suspect has been arrested and one's been charged and is to appear before the court. Building on what Davy Beck said, our response to these crimes is extremely successful in prosecuting those responsible. I know, because there'd been a football match that weekend, with regards to the Friday events, we had an incredible amount of resource thrown at the attack on this poor 26-year-old girl at that particular incident that evening extremely quickly. And obviously we were quite disappointed that we weren't able to identify and trace the perpetrator because of the numbers of officers that we had there. What I would say is if anybody whatsoever has any information about who may be responsible for the attacks on Friday the 1st of November and Saturday the 2nd of November, the first offence being at Drummerhoe, the park in Drummerhoe, and the second offence being at the top of the hill park, where both of these victims incredibly bravely fought off their attacker. If anybody has any information, please contact us with that information. I don't think there's a lot more I want to say at this stage because of elements of the investigation that I know about that I don't want to compromise. But I want to reassure you, Mark, and I know understandably you'd have real concerns about the area and the level of policing response. I spoke to Gillian Kearney personally about the resources she's got to support this. I also spoke to Lindsay Fisher about the investigation. We don't just say we're doing this, we are doing it. Obviously nothing would please me more than to get an arrest in what's happened that Friday and Saturday. But we're doing everything we can to achieve the success of the like that Davy's talked about in other cases. I will, just in case Davy feels he wants to say anything about that particular case, I'll just look. I don't know if you do. No, or Bobby? Bobby?
Yeah, just to say, Mark, I think Gillian said in the media this week that the kind of reassurance plan around that will continue for as long as it needs to, and it'll be no time now before we're starting operation season screenings as well, which will have a key strand in it around violence against women and girls. And like always, we're very fortunate to enjoy really good, strong partnerships in the city, and we're really grateful to the support that we've had from Floyd Women's Aid and the Women's Centre up there in terms of helping us, helping inform the nature and the style and tone of the policing response as well. So we're going to continue to work with everybody, including city centre management, because we know nighttime economy and concerns are going to be a real issue, both for people going into the city themselves, but also for traders, because it's their most important, biggest time of the year, so people need to feel safe in the city, and we'll be doing everything we can to make sure that they do.
Thank you to you both. I suppose that there's a fine line between raising vigilance and giving that assurance and creating panic. But now the family of one of the victims from the weekend have been in touch with me and have been complimentary of the police response under Gillian's leadership as well. But it's important we support that as much as we can.
Conscious of time, we are already over time. I'm going to allow another maybe 7 minutes, which will be maybe 2 questions. Anybody else? We can move into the private session, or we can do by written response. I'm going to ask Trevor to come in.
Thank you. I'll hold some of my other questions until the private session, Chair. So, but I want to ask a couple. I want to make a point. You did talk about some good police work, and there is some good police work. Serious assault at the weekend in Antrim. Unfortunately, the man has passed away, but swift arrest. So I want to commend the officers involved in that, and also sympathise with the family of the bereaved on that case. I'm just going to roll this into three quick ones. You referenced there meeting the Lady Chief Justice. In terms of your conversation with Lady Chief Justice, has she made any representation of your review to close protection? And thirdly, the body-worn videos, and I appreciate what you said, and I think that's proportionate in terms of your response. The only question I have around that is, and I suppose there's just always an opinion of who those were, could you give us an indication of whether all constables or with the various ranks?
Firstly, thank you for the acknowledgement of what the officers did. That's very kind, Trevor. And as I say, I'll never tire of thanking them. The close protection issue, I've met the Lady Chief Justice on that issue. I've asked to meet the judges. The date has now been set for me to meet the judges. We've shared a policy that's been crafted very well by Mel Jones around how we intend to deal with protection issues. We've had discussions about this around the proportionality of the protection levels that we're currently providing here. I think we've got, the number changes very slightly, but I think it's maybe 98 protected persons currently. That's unsustainable. I think the Met have below 40 if you look at the sizes of the organisations. So I am due to meet the judge, and there is a date before, I'm pretty sure it's before Christmas, so it's going to be an interesting conversation. With regards to breakdown of the officers, forgive me, I'm going to look at Chris. Oh, we don't have that. Can I get back to you on that? Is that all right? Yeah, of course. I'll send a written response, Trevor. All right.
Okay, I'm just going to summarise all the other questions so that you know the topics that members are concerned or issue or want to raise, and then we'll take one question. We have one question which will probably come up in the private session on the McCartney case in relation to catfishing. Alan Chambers is asking about the welfare and support for officers and staff, which I also mentioned in the opening remarks. And Keith Buchanan, you had something on ramming of police vehicles. I'm going to open the last question to Les around professional standards.
Thank you, Chair. Chief Constable, to come back to the issue touched on earlier of misconduct. We recently received a copy of the Professional Standards Annual Report and the work undertaken to deal with breaches of the Code of Ethics. Two quick questions. First, could you provide a public-facing version of the report to provide wider reassurance of the work that you and your colleagues are undertaking? And second, I wonder if you'd comment on the current policy where we see officers resigning or retiring from the service while facing ongoing misconduct proceedings, and how could that be tackled so that officers are properly held to account if they are found to have committed misconduct or worse?
Yeah, thank you, Les. Thank you for the question, and thank you for the acknowledgement of the annual professional standards report. I would be very keen to put that into the public domain. We'll just need to check with regards to content of the report that we do that responsibly and properly. I think that goes to the very heart of our openness and transparency. So we'll look to do that, and I've had a conversation with Chris about that. I will bring Chris in around, again, this is an interesting challenge around officers undergoing misconduct. The regulations in England and Wales in effect mean that you can't retire out of misconduct, if that makes sense. Yeah. We don't have, our regulations differ, so it's not policy, it's regulations. There is a conundrum that often, and it's a frustration often reported in the media, that officers who are facing misconduct are paid as police officers when the misconduct takes quite a lot of time, and the ultimate sanction is that they're simply going to be sacked from the organisation. So you're paying public money for somebody that you're going to get rid of. So there's some issues to consider. We have a very clear position on the standards in this organisation. I chair a number of panels, fast-track panels, and just to reassure you around the the standards, the code of ethics, the behaviours and the integrity of this organisation. And I haven't got national data, but I'd be very comfortable that the data will support it. The standard of behaviours of our officers is of a high standard comparatively with policing elsewhere in the United Kingdom. But I don't want to get into a position where we are keeping officers because these processes take such an unwieldy amount of time, when if there's a way that we can get rid of them and we can put them on a barred list so there's the transparency so they can't go and work somewhere else. And you'll remember there are issues around that with regards to Police Constable Wayne Cousins and when he joined the Metropolitan Police. So I don't want to keep officers who are just going to go through a formal process of misconduct and get sacked, but we have to also balance that with the fairness of those officers. But quite often we know if we've got the evidence, so we need to deal with it pragmatically. But let me bring Chris in with regards to point 2.
Thank you, Chief. Thank you, Les. I think the Chief has covered most of the points off, Les, to be fair, but just a couple of additional points, and I fully support the publication and transparency around the material. We'll make sure we can support that. As the Chief says, it is about regulations, not policy. So the regulations in England and Wales allow you to bring an officer back after they've retired to face misconduct. We are working with the Department of Justice to look at changing the regulations in Northern Ireland to something equivalent. But we recognise the vulnerability there. There is that balance between paying somebody public money for the purpose of misconduct proceedings when they're not delivering policing. That doesn't feel it's in the public interest. So we do feel that the regulations are flawed in that respect. As a safeguard, where we do have people who will retire and misconduct proceedings then have to legally be brought to a close, we put a record on our intelligence systems to that effect, which will then be a flag effectively in any subsequent vetting. So this is to capture anyone who might, tactically want to avoid misconduct and seek a job elsewhere. If there's any vetting checks, it will be captured. We will make it clear that the misconduct was incomplete.
Thanks, Chair. Just to say, would welcome, I think, the finding parity with England and Wales, and recognise that this is not a matter entirely within your gift, but I think it's important that happens sooner rather than later. So thank you. Thanks for the response.
Thank you. And first of all, could I apologise for running over? I think the questioning was good, and I think we've established a lot of good responses. Thank you, Chief Constable, to you and your team for being here today. We will have another private session, and any questions that we weren't able to cover, we'll bring those into that session. Could I also thank those who have joined us online, and look forward to seeing you at the same place, same time, festive time on the 5th of December, I believe. That's going to be on Thursday. So thank you.
Thank you, Chair.